In the previous episode, we saw how a simple boy named Yeon-woo was in love with his classmate Soyeon. The teens went on a class trip to the Namsan cable car. Suddenly, as they were descending, a pigeon infected with the frog egg virus crashed into the booth. The classmates who managed to escape from the booth began to get infected one by one and turn into zombie monsters. The rest of the class stayed in the booth and survived. They got to the cable car building when suddenly the beloved Jeonhwa Soyeon was about to be attacked by a monster. Without hesitation, Jeonwoo ran across the entire floor, distracting the monster and saving his beloved. But unfortunately, his classmates thanked him by running out of the building while Jeonwoo was saving their lives. He was heartbroken by this betrayal, but he found his friend Kim Joo-bin in a toilet stall, who had also been left behind. Watch how the two friends got out of the building full of zombies in this episode. Joo-bin did not like this idea. He said it was better to just close the door and stay inside. Yeon-woo suggested another method, just running away. Joo-bin insisted that his friend go and lock the door, because hell could happen again. Yeon-woo obeyed and went to the exit to check that everything was clear. The guy stopped. Something caught his attention. He looked again at the window and the broken pot, the place where his classmates had run away. A frightened Joo-bin ran up to Yeon-woo. He nervously asked what had happened and how his classmates had escaped. It was strange that Joo-bin did not know how the teenagers had escaped. Jeon-woo said he knew how they escaped. He showed me where his classmates ran. Those moments of the classroom escape ran through his mind again. It was very painful for him. He remembered Soyeon's last look, though it was surprisingly quite frightened. She saw him in the window, but did not stop and continued to run away, although he saved her life twice. Meanwhile, Kim Joo-bin continued to complain about his classmates. He said they had abandoned them, as if they were nothing, and that they could no longer call them friends. They could not even go out through them. The monsters outside began to gather and group together, but Yeon-woo interrupted his friend's monologue. He asked why Joo-bin didn't go with them. Couldn't he duck and now pretend that his classmates left him alone? Kim Joo-bin began to make excuses that it was not like that and that he was right. It was Yeon-woo who was the snotty one, not him. The boys sat silently alone in a corner of the second floor. Joo-bin interrupted the deathly silence. He asked how long they had to stay in the building in this state. The guy asked if Jeon-woo was hungry. It is not clear how long they have been waiting here. Yeon-woo said they spent about an hour alone, abandoned on the second floor, looking down sadly. It turned out that the guy was looking at his phone. It was making a call to 119, but there was no connection. Joo-bin was surprised that his friend was still calling security. It was obviously not the first call in an hour. However, Yeon-woo reassured his friend that his parents were almost there to help them. But this did not calm Jae-bin down a bit. After all, nothing would change if Yeon-woo's parents came. There is no way out of the building. Yeon-woo stuck to his opinion because there had to be some other way and continued to search for something on his phone. He received a message from his mother on his phone asking him to watch the news. The situation is really scary, and it is better for the boys not to go out and stay in the building. The mom also sent a link to a news video. Jeon-woo opened it and started watching the video. It said that in some areas of Seoul, where cells of an unknown virus appeared, the government declared an extremely dangerous disaster zone situation. The guys were in the epicenter of the events. The reporter went on to say that martial law had been declared for the first time in 40 years. Therefore, roads and facilities close to the epicenter are blocked. This meant that the guys could not get out of here. They are locked in, and it is not clear when they will be rescued, and if they will be rescued at all. Joo-bin's mood had noticeably deteriorated. Yeon-woo noticed this and asked if he was okay. The boy asked him to be quiet, holding his head. Suddenly the boy heard something. He looked up to see what was happening outside the window. They were fire trucks, several of them. Will they finally be rescued and this nightmare will end? Yeon-woo asked Joo-bin if those were fire trucks. The first thing he thought was that there was a fire in the building. Joo-bin's mood was pessimistic. He said that firefighters did not come to save them. He added that if he could, he would have set the damn place on fire. But Yeon-woo's attention was interrupted by a fire in a neighboring building. It looked like no one was going to save them. The guy got up and went somewhere. When Kim Jubin asked him, he said that he needed a trash can, but his friend still didn't understand why he needed it. Youngwoo said it was a good idea and worth a try, but Jubin didn't understand what his friend was talking about or what the idea was. The guy said they should try to create a fire. Maybe then the firemen would come to save them. Jubin did not like this idea. Although he suggested it, he didn't mean it. Burning alive was not part of his plans. Yeonwoo began to carefully examine the room in search of a trash can. Finally, the guy found it and started running to find a lighter and set it on fire. Jubin stood behind him and couldn't believe that his friend Yeonwoo really wanted to do that. The guy stuck his hand into a disgusting trash can full of all kinds of scraps in search of a lighter. Yeonwoo even turned on the flashlight on his phone to see everything better and make sure he didn't miss what he was looking for. Jubin didn't stop yelling at his friend. He still didn't believe that Yeonwoo wanted to set the place on fire, but he was convinced that if there was a fire, they would definitely come to put it out. Suddenly, Kim Jubin's face changed dramatically and turned pale. It looked like he had seen something he didn't want to see. Meanwhile, Jeonwoo reached into another trash can and, surprisingly, found a lighter. The boy shouted with joy. His life had regained hope for salvation. The only thing left to do was to set fire to the bucket and wait for the firefighters. Yeonwoo ran to Kim Jubin to share the good news. On the way, he tried to light a lighter, but it seemed to be out of gas, so it didn't work. As soon as Yeonwoo approached his friend, Jubin immediately began to cover his mouth. He looked very scared and nervous, cautiously peeking out from behind the wall. Yeonwoo did not understand his friend's condition and told him to hurry up and move on, but Jubin interrupted him with a strong swear word. It seems that something happened after all. Kim Jubin saw a zombie monster in the doorway, unable to leave. Had they really been in the same room all this time? Yeonwoo also leaned over from behind the wall to see what had shocked and frightened his friend so much. The boy's face immediately changed. When they looked closely, they noticed that the zombie monster was still outside the door, but most likely heading toward them. They needed a new plan to save themselves. The events moved to the Seoul highway. There was a huge traffic jam because the roads were blocked. The news showed this highway and said that the government was focused on preventing the spread of the virus. Thanks to videos shot by some isolated citizens, the whole of Seoul was drowning in the apocalypse of this virus. Everything was covered with its white cells, as if a spider was spreading its web. This was the news that Jeonwoo's mother read on her phone on the way to his house. She screamed out in horror and told her husband that it looked like the situation was much worse than they thought. They drove up to the road and stopped because the highway was blocked. Each car was checked by a checkpoint. The boy's mother began to quickly dial her son Yeonhwa, but he did not answer the phone. The father said that there might be a problem with the connection, but that was impossible, because their son had picked up the phone before. At this time, Yeonwoo's pocket was ringing and vibrating loudly, but the boy could not be distracted because the monster could hear. Luckily, the zombie monster was still standing at the door. The guys had time to come up with a plan, but suddenly, Yeonwoo's face changed dramatically. He opened his mouth and wanted to scream, but he held back. Something seemed to scare him. The zombie monster moved, but it didn't seem to be going after the boys. False alarm. Jeonwoo watched the monster from around the corner for a while longer. In the end, the guy said he didn't think the zombie monster was going to come in. Perhaps if they were quiet, it would go away, and the boys would continue their plan to save the day. Indeed, the zombie monster was standing calmly at the entrance. Kim Jubin began to panic and complain about how scared he was when he saw the monster. It appeared very suddenly. Yeonwoo supported him in this, but the boy told his friend Jubin that he thought the monster was getting bigger. Yeonwoo went on to say that the white things on his face looked like frog eggs. Then the zombie monster roared. Jubin was very frightened and screamed, hoping that the monster did not hear him. Looking closely, the guy really noticed that the blisters that covered 99% of the monster's body, except for the mouth, looked like frog eggs. It was quite disgusting to look at. Jubin swore and started making sounds like vomiting. Yeonwoo asked if his friend was okay. My friend shook it off, but he looked very bad. Was his delicate nature really that affected by the frog eggs? Yeonwoo asked again if his friend was okay. Jubin assured him not to worry about him. Jubin pulled himself together, looked his friend straight in the eye, and asked him again if he was going to set fire to the building, that the firefighters had noticed them and saved them. He asked Yongwoo to hurry up and finally do something. The guy looked at the almost empty lighter in his hand and began to think about his and Jubin's rescue plan. Yonwoo looked at his friend, out of breath and scared to death, and asked him if he thought everything would be okay. After all, one wrong move, and they would burn in this room. The events moved to the cable car. Everything there was covered with mucus mixed with frog eggs. Suddenly, from behind the booth, Yonwoo jumped out quietly like a ninja. He landed. He looked around the room and the cable car. He also looked to see if the monster was still standing still. Everything was fine. Time to act now. Meanwhile, Kim Jubin stood guard and watched the zombie monster, although he was afraid to even breathe next to it. The boys met and sat down on the stairs. Yonwoo said he was not sure it was a good idea to start a fire because they could die from breathing in the smoke from the fire. Kim Jubin asked what they should do then. Yonwoo suggested going to the third floor. It looked like the guy had a plan. The plan was to have one entrance and one exit on each floor. The guys were on the second floor. So while one of them is distracting the monster at the entrance, the other one will go upstairs and start a fire on the third floor. Since the cable car was located outside, the sprinkler would not be able to extinguish the fire, and that is why the smoke and fire would only spread. Jubin asked who would go upstairs. He thought Yongwoo's plan was quite reliable, so he had no objections. The boys looked at each other and silently agreed on who would go upstairs to start a fire. Kim Jubin stayed behind to distract the smoby monster. He was already feeling sorry for Yonwoo and cursing him. After all, his friend would definitely brag to the others that he was the one who climbed up, although it was his idea, so he had to do it. You can't envy Jubin either because he was one-on-one with a huge, voracious monster. Meanwhile, Yonwoo reached the third floor. The lighter surprisingly worked. The boys were lucky. Suddenly something distracted the rescuer. He heard some strange sounds. He looked up to see what was going on, but there was nothing to see. Jubin was supposed to take care of it, so Yongwoo didn't get distracted anymore. He said to himself that he believed in his friend. He had to believe in him and finish his work. There was only a little more to go, and salvation was at hand. Yonwoo takes a piece of paper from his briefcase and sets it on fire. The next in line was a sack. The boy was getting more and more excited. The fact that he was able to do it gave him confidence, but the joy did not last long. The boy was not allowed to finish the job because a monster suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Yonwoo was setting fire to it when he heard the familiar roar of a zombie monster. The giant climbed out of the roof of the booth. Its mouth was open as if it was preparing to bite. The boy, seeing this, immediately ran away as fast as he could. He didn't understand whether it was the same monster that was on the second floor or a different one, and now there were two of them chasing the boys. The monster jumped out of the booth and growled, which scared the boy and gave him even more strength and motivation to escape. However, Yonwoo could not get far from the zombie monster. The giant was literally breathing down his neck, but he didn't let that stop him and kept running. The giant monster let out its white, ugly tentacles from its mouth to catch up with Yonva. The guy screamed. He did not expect to meet the monster because he was hoping for Kim Jubin. His plan was almost perfect. The young man was holding a piece of paper that he had managed to light. Without hesitation, he threw it to the monster right into its vile tentacles. This gave the daredevil a little head start, and he was able to break away from the zombie monster. Yonwoo was a few steps away from the exit. The boy turned around to see how far he was from the monster, but what happened shocked Yonhwa very much. He saw that such a huge and strong zombie monster began to burn. He was afraid of fire. He stopped and watched what would happen next. It was a hope for salvation and at least some minimal safety. The monster burned down completely. It turned out to be flammable, even though it was made of wet frog eggs. Yonwoo did not move. He stood there in silent amazement looking at the picture. He had just found a way to kill this virus. The guy could not believe what was happening. Almost the entire zombie monster burned down, leaving only the bones behind. Yonwoo did two things at once. He killed the monster and started the fire. Suddenly, the guy's phone rang. Someone was calling him. It was Kim Jubin. Yonwoo immediately began to brag that he had killed the monster and that it had burned alive, but his friend loudly ordered him to come down. Something must have happened. Jubin said that the zombie monster was gone and he thought the giant had gone upstairs. Then who was burned by Yonwoo, but he wasn't sure he could go back down. He also informed his friend Kim Jubin about this. His friend did not understand why. Yeonwoo explained that when he was lighting the fire, the monster attacked him, but he was able to set it on fire. Everything was so hot that the fire blocked Yeonwoo's exit. He didn't think about this when he was running away from the monster, but there was no other option. It was either him or him. Yeonwoo ran to the scene of the fire, and once again made sure that he would not be able to pass through. The fire was getting worse, and there was nothing to put it out. The guy asked Jubin what he should do. His friend yelled at him, called him an idiot, and ordered him to go downstairs as quickly as possible, because he had little time left. Yeonwoo heard something behind him and turned around. However, the guy saw nothing. Everything was empty, except for some mucus on the floor, ceiling, and walls. Suddenly, another monster came out from around the corner. It seemed to be the one that Jubin had been following. This monster was huge, twice as big as the one Yeonwoo had burned. The guy screamed and hung up the phone. It was time to run away, and quickly. If he didn't know how zombie monsters were made, he would never have guessed that there was a person inside that ugly, faceless giant. Perhaps it was Gale. But there was nowhere to run. There was a fire behind him and a giant monster in front of him that wanted to eat him. There were even more monsters on top. Meanwhile, the fire was getting worse. There was even more smoke. Yeonwoo had to choose which danger was safer at that moment. The guy decides to take off his shirt. It looks like he has a new plan. The monster was getting closer and closer, but Yeonwoo was not going to run away. The guy set his hoodie on fire. The monster pounced on Yeonwoo. Its mouth is about to reach the boy. The young man took a swing and threw this Molotov cocktail at the zombie monster with all his might. Now we had to run away. The fire became even worse. It was getting harder for the guy to breathe. The guy wanted to escape so badly that he forgot to throw away his hoodie and kept running with it. The monster's face was tortured. It seemed to melt and melt before our eyes. The guy realized that fire was his weakness, so he needed to burn this nasty zombie monster. While the monster was recovering from the last portion of fire, Yeonwoo swung with all his might and threw his burning jacket at the beast. The jacket was caught nearby. A little more and the monster would have caught fire. Shocked, Yeonwoo stood in a stupor. He had just exhaled a hopeful breath when, through the wind, his life was once again one step away from death. The monster saw that he was safe and growled at the boy. Now the giant zombie giant had a new goal. He had to take revenge on the boy for setting him on fire. Yeonwoo covered his face with his hands. He realized that he had nowhere to run, so he would at least save Jubin, so he just closed his eyes and prepared to die. And then, out of nowhere, a lit piece of paper came flying in. It was unrealistic luck. The arsonist flew right into the monster. It had not yet had time to attack the boy, so Yeonwoo was saved. The guy stood up. He should have been dead by now, so he hadn't quite recovered and realized what was going on. That was Kim Jubin. He was running into danger, swearing and throwing burning paper to save his friend. The guy made another attempt and threw another arson at the monster. The boy's eyes were filled with hatred and fear. The adrenaline in his blood was going through the roof and gave him the strength to defend his friend Yeonwoo. And this target hit the monster right in the back. The poor thing growled, "It is painful to be burned alive." Yeonwoo watched in a stupor. He still could not believe that he was alive. Kim Jubin recovered his friend. He yelled at him and told him to run away immediately. Yeonwoo did just that. After all, this monster was twice as big as the previous one, so 2 fires did not deprive it of much power. The boys quickly descended the stairs. The main thing was that the monster did not follow them, and the second floor did not start to burn. The boys ran away screaming as fast as they could. Now they faced 2 dangers, the monster and the fire, which was getting stronger and stronger. Kim Jubin was the first to run. He was not as brave as his friend, so the adrenaline in his blood prevented him from thinking critically and analyzing the situation. Because of this, the boy did not notice the piece of white slime in front of him. If he stepped on it, he would also turn into a monster and most likely burn in this building. Kim Jubin didn't want to die, so he stopped in front of the mucus, but his coordination was impaired, so he just fell face down the stairs. Yeonwoo saw this and ran to help his friend. He promised Jubin his life for his salvation. The guy landed surprisingly on his hands. He didn't seem to hurt anything, but there was another pile of white dangerous virus in front of him. Luckily, Kim Jubin landed right in front of this bunch, so he didn't get infected and won't turn into a big ugly monster that wants to eat everyone. Jubin stood up, but lost his coordination and started to fall. Fortunately, Yongwoo ran up to him and caught his friend. However, Zhubin's reaction was not friendly. He pushed the guy's hand away and told him to get off him. Janwoo did not understand why his friend was so angry. His eyes burned with rage. Zhubin was seriously angry. The guy kept yelling. He was calling Yonwoo a snotty brat who thought he was a hero, but couldn't set fire to the place and was sporting everything. If only Yonwoo had listened to Zhubin, all this would not have happened. The guy did not stop. It was as if he wanted to unleash all the anger and fear he had accumulated during the day on his friend. Zhubin called Yonwoo a bastard. He added that the guy was a snotty little brat and nothing else. Yonwoo was shocked. He did not expect to hear such things from his friend. He understood that Zhubin's words were spoken out of emotion, but he would not tolerate such name-calling. It was the last straw. Yonwoo shouted back and elbowed the guy. Now the boy spoke. He yelled back at his friend Zhubin. Did he really want to die? Yongwoo asked why he was angry with him, because it wasn't the boy's fault that the monster had attacked them all. Yonwoo added that Zhubin was like a scared puppy who could do nothing, because he was so scared and couldn't pull himself together in time. Zhubin called him a bastard again. His friend's words had really hurt him, so now he was burning with rage. Zhubin did not know how to accept his weaknesses. Jonah's mind was blown. The words just kept pouring out of his mouth, stinging his friend like a bee. He said that Zhubin was pathetic because he said that he was the one who abandoned his classmates, when in fact, he was afraid to crouch down and follow them. It was very obvious, but Zhubin denied it. The friend called Yonva a snotty little boy and asked him if he thought he hadn't been dumped. The guy started making excuses, saying that he was just a little late, that's all. But Yubin didn't believe him. The boys were about to beat each other up. Then Janwoo noticed something that changed his expression. Zhubin had already returned. They could not believe what they were seeing. Another monster roared at them from the floor below. It was sucked into a pile of slime that was simply spread out on the floor. The boys screamed at what they saw. They immediately forgot about the quarrel. The most important thing now was to run away and save their lives. The monster attacked them, jumping off the ground like a frog. But at that time, the guys were already running away as fast as they could, only having time to turn around and see what was happening behind them. Yonwoo was the last to run, so he managed to close the door behind him. The monster remained outside. After clearing his throat, Janwoo said they were safe now. It was time to clear the air and figure out a plan of action. The door was closed, so the monster definitely could not get inside to see the boys. Suddenly, the guys' faces changed and they screamed in a chorus. The monster's tentacles began to crawl through the door and attack the boys. The two friends started to run away, but they had nowhere to run. They had to come up with a new plan. Zhubin again attacked Yanhua, accusing him of saying that the monster could not pass through a closed door. They came back to see how the monster was doing and saw that more and more of it was crawling inside. This process was quite slow, so the boys had a head start to escape and think of a new rescue plan. Janwoo ordered his friend to shut his mouth and run. They needed to get to the other side somehow. The boys froze again in puzzlement. They seemed to see something shocking in front of them. Behind the door was a bunch of monsters chained to the ground with white, disgusting slime. They couldn't get out. The guys were trapped. Janwoo screamed at the top of his lungs. He did not understand what was happening. What kind of apocalypse was happening in this building? White slime was everywhere outside. The entire building was completely covered with a thick carpet of disgusting slime mixed with dead bodies. Suddenly, something squeaked loudly, which scared the boys. Zhubin jumped up and down in fear. The guys turned toward the sound. Something from the wall was making a terrible, piercingly loud sound, like an alarm. It turned out that it was a fire alarm. It looks like the guy's plan was working. Realizing that it was just an alarm, the boys calmed down. The fire truck was coming soon, so they would be rescued, and the boys would forget the story like a bad dream. However, something frightened the boys again, and they turned their heads in the other direction. Yongwoo and Zhubin saw black, thick smoke coming from the third floor. It looked like the fire had spread in earnest. It would be easier for the rescuers to find them, because now the burning building was visible from afar. But Janwoo took a lighter out of his pocket. He tried to light it. Zhubin yelled at his friend. He didn't understand why Yongwoo needed a lighter. Did he really want to start another fire? The boy said he would try his best to rekindle the fire. He told his friend Jubin to find something that could be easily lit as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the body of the zombie monster was almost completely inside. Only its legs remained outside the door. Time was running out. Yeonwoo nervously tried to light the lighter, but it wouldn't give in. There were only sparks. He yelled at the lighter to make it work. The young man's heart was beating frantically. He had to act quickly to save his life. Yeonwoo begged the lighter to produce at least a small flash of light, continuing to nervously light it again and again. Kim Jubin ran up to the boy. He asked if they had time for this and brought a piece of paper that looked like a newspaper. Now Yeonwoo and Jubin were shouting and cursing at the lighter together because it didn't want to work. Suddenly, Jubin's face changed dramatically, as if he had seen something very terrible. When Yeonwoo saw Jubin's appearance, he turned his head and screamed. His friend began to run away. It turned out that behind the boys, there was a hole in the window from which their classmates had escaped, and another zombie monster was crawling out of the hole and into their classroom. Yeonwoo fell on his friend Jubin in fear and screamed. There was nowhere to run. They had to figure out what to do quickly. Meanwhile, the monster was slowly but surely climbing up the wall and climbing out through the window. These monsters never ceased to amaze. Yeonwoo screamed even louder. He could not believe that zombie monsters were capable of such things. Just then, Jubin's victorious shout was heard from behind the boy. He was running and obviously headed for the monster. The fearless friend was holding a pot. Yeonwoo could not understand what Jubin was trying to do. He swung, screamed, and threw a pot of plants at the monster. The flower pot flew straight to the target, right in the zombie monster's head. The pot broke, making a loud crashing sound. And under the flattened one was a monster. It looked like it was dead. Jubin and Yeonwoo screamed. Yeonwoo could not yet analyze what had just happened, and Jubin could not believe that he had killed a monster and was not afraid. Under the pot, there was white mucus mixed with the earth, like blood. The boys could not believe that the zombie monster was really dead. Jubin turned to his friend and began to brag. He said that Yeonwoo should take back what he said about him. Jubin no longer looked like a scared puppy who was afraid of his own shadow. Yeonwoo said that now was not the time to talk about it and looked nervously at the floor. But Jubin was not deterred by the frightened look on his friend's face. He continued to remind him that he had saved Yeonwoo's life twice. He realized that he should just agree with his friend and say that he was cool. Letting Jubin have some fun might have given him the self-confidence he clearly lacked. Just then, Yeonwoo's face changed dramatically. His mouth opened wide and his eyes looked like two healthy oranges. Something had clearly shocked the young man. Jubin asked why his friend had stopped talking and stopped praising him. However, the boy did not see that behind him, a zombie monster was rising, covered in earth and with a pot on his head, and it seemed that he was not dead. Yeonwoo shouted that Jubin had come back. He was so worried about his friend because the zombie monster was just a step away. When Jubin turned his head, the huge monster had already risen and roared. It seemed to be very angry with the boy's actions and wanted to pay back. Unfortunately, Kim Jubin didn't have time to react, and the monster managed to attack before the boys started to run away. The giant's tentacles were already flying at poor Jubin. Yeonwoo fell to the ground behind him. He watched the monster eat his friend and couldn't do anything. The boy was as terrified as Jubin. All Yeonwoo had was a lighter. He nervously tried to light it. It was a matter of life and death, and the lighter was his last hope. The guy was screaming and swearing at the lighter because it didn't work. He looked at his friend, who was almost completely eaten by the monster. He felt so sorry for his friend. If he set fire to the monster, Jubin would burn as well, but it was worth a try. There was no other way out. Yeonwoo shouted his friend's name, as if to let him know that he was there trying to save Jubin. He couldn't let him be eaten by the monster. Meanwhile, the zombie monster had already reached the boy's face. Was it really the end? The chances of survival were decreasing every second. The giant was very strong. Yeonwoo nervously lit the lighter again and again. A little more and the boy started to cry, but he held on for the sake of his friend. He had to save him at any cost. Jubin's face began to turn white. Frog eggs appeared like pimples on his face. The last thing Jubin said were words of help. He looked at his friend and begged for Yeonwoo to think of something. The guy saw it and screamed. He felt so helpless and guilty for what had happened. In his eyes and cry, you could feel the sadness for his friend. Jubin's body began to merge into one with the zombie monster. He couldn't speak anymore, only mumbled. It seemed to be very painful. Jongwoo did not give up and continued to light the lighter. It was supposed to produce a flame. It hit water and stone. Suddenly, the lighter finally produced the long-awaited flame. Hope for rescue returned. Jongwoo just had to figure out how to save his friend. But the joy did not last long. The boy heard strange, familiar screams. He looked up and could not believe his eyes. A zombie monster entered the room, which Jongwoo had forgotten about while he was busy saving his friend Juben. But the monster did not forget. All this time, it had been crawling through the door a little bit at a time, and now it was heading for Jongwoo to eat him. The boy screamed. He didn't know what to do or who to save.